Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Law Forum, the longest-running American Law School speaker series. I am Pete Davis, a 3L here at the Law School, and for one more hour, I am the chair of the Harvard Law Forum. This is my final forum event. I'm really proud of what has happened at the forum. I've hosted 30 speakers over the past 2 years, moral philosophers, crusaders, politicians, policy visionaries, and practical dreamers. I've tried my best to make the forum a home for what really matters in a school too often distracted by what doesn't. I'd like to start by just one more thing on the forum. I'd like to thank the unofficial members of the forum, which are my friends that have come by and helped me set everything up over the years, which is Ross, Espo, Danny, Nate. Thank you for all the times where you've opened the pizzas and fought off professors yelling at taking over the room many times. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor for this specific event, the Labor and Employment Action Project, LEAP. LEAP, are there any important local union votes coming up, say, on April 18th or 19th?
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel, I'm a 1L.
I'm Tristan, I'm a 3L.
And we're working with LEAP as well as with the Harvard Graduate Student Union, UAW. There's a union election coming up on April 18th and 19th. All students who are working as, grad students who are working as RAs, TAs, or BSAs here at the law school are eligible to vote. There are specific times where you should voting is open from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. Voting will take place at the Cambridge Queen's Head Pub, despite what it says on the sheet. It's not that. So these are commitment cards for coming out to vote yes. I have them here. We'll pass them around and collect them after this. But if you have any questions about the union, feel free to come and talk to us. We think this is really important for building student worker power at this university and advocating for the issues that matter most, whether that's wages and healthcare or issues of combating sexual harassment and discrimination, and just more broadly, making sure that we have a voice in this university. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Leap. Another unofficial forum helper walked in, Lark, over there. So, and for this reason, I mentioned that the Harvard Law Forum was about what really matters, and I'm so happy that my final forum speaker is Jane McAlevey, because she not only knows about what matters, she also has some ideas about what we should do about it. She knows that you are not serious about law and politics if you are not grappling with the fact that we live in a new Gilded Age. She also knows that we will not be able to respond to this new Gilded Age with gimmicks, no app, no targeted mail campaign, no super lobbyists, no flashy YouTube videos, no AI, no pre-planned hashtag, and no shallow mobilization strategy is going to save us. Only the slow and steady and smart work of organizing is. Jane McAlevey is a longtime organizer in the environmental and labor movements. She's a contributing writer at The Nation magazine, is the author of Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, and No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age, which we have copies of and selling for $10 afterwards. She has returned to Harvard Law School to share her experience and insights into what it will take to organize deep worker power in our new Gilded Age for one final time. Let's hear it for our forum speaker. Thank you.
That was a fabulous introduction. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I've got to practice that again, all right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah, so much better. Hi. I am delighted to be here, and that was like a great introduction. I don't know who takes over the forum after you. Do we know?
We got Martin Drake.
Yay! Okay, so whoever that is, great. I'm excited. It's interesting to me that somehow in the last few weeks, I wound up at 2 law schools on polar opposite sides of the country. As the guest of some students. I was at Bolt at Berkeley several weeks ago. And I think it's really great that there are law students who are trying to think about more than simply the law. Because we're not in a period where we're relying on the law, quite frankly, and just lawyers is going to do it. though we do actually really need to have good, smart lawyers, by the way, and strategic lawyers who understand, like, what's the legal intervention in today's fight, because that matters a lot. And I would say in every important campaign I've led, there's been a role to have really, really smart lawyers there. So we need a lot of really smart lawyers. So I want to thank Pete again. And what I'm going to try to not take up the whole time. I want to try and run through a series of slides and leave at least some time for question and answer and discussion. And of course, at the very end, we'll come back to the important vote that's coming up next week at Harvard and give them all a big cheer and see what they need from us. But so just to get started, I think the main thing I want to say is that there's a lot of discussion in the United States about income inequality. And at the root of income inequality is something much more profound, which is what we actually have to get at, I believe, and what I want to talk about today, which is a power inequality in American society. Like, the root of income inequality is actually something far deeper, and it's a power inequality. And power is what workers need to actually readjust the income inequality. There's not going to be any other way to frankly get at what it is that workers in the working class need, either in the United States or in the world, unless we deal with a profound power imbalance. So if you can glean from the title of my second book, which was my late-in-life PhD dissertation, and you would also glean from my first book, and anything I talk about and do. And oh, look, there's Jack, or the classes I was teaching as part of the Harvard Labor and Worklife Program for a couple of years, the theme of which was power and strategy, that I'm pretty much obsessed about power and strategy. And I think they're the two topics that we don't pay enough attention to if we consider ourselves progressive or hoping that something will change, because it won't change absent a really serious discussion about power. So that's the focus of what I want to talk about, and pretty much what I always talk about. I just realized I can't see what I'm doing up here, but that's okay. So this is obviously, I'm going to weave in and out of West Virginia, because it seems like that's a great thing to do today, meaning West Virginia, not the state, but the huge victory on the part of the education unions in West Virginia recently, which to me was one of the most important strikes in my lifetime. I'm older than, well, at least a bunch of you. But if I benchmarked strikes that I can actually talk about, that I lived through, I'm putting West Virginia pretty high on the list. For a whole lot of reasons, which I'll spend a few minutes on. So that's a picture of the West Virginia folks protesting at the Capitol, and I love the sign that one of them is holding, which says, in the 1990s, my teacher taught me to value my worth, say I lead by example. And that sign is because that person was a student in the 1990s strike. That's really what the sign is a reflection of. So what I want to do, and I think it's going to help Pete if I just stay closer over here as my guest room, because I'm a wanderer, so that might be a problem. But so the theme of the strike is strikes as structure test, why strikes and unions matter a lot, and why winning matters, which are both super important. So again, I want to talk about power and strategy. And I think for anyone who is thinking about how do we change the world, what do we do? How do we win on our campus? How do we stop? I think things are bad, when Madeleine Albright uses the word fascism in the New York Times, right? Like, I've been dancing around using the word fascism, for the last year and a half. Like, I don't want to be hyperbolic, you know what I mean? Like, let's keep it real. It's definitely creeping authoritarianism. But then when Madeleine Albright, who, by the way, is partly, responsible for how we got here, along with a lot of other neoliberals, for her to come all out and use fascism in the New York Times was like, all right, well, let's just start using that word then. So if you're thinking about how do we defeat the rise of fascism or the re-rise of fascism, and by the way, it's certainly not unique to the United States, right? Like, my work now is in Canada, Europe, Australia. It's around the world that the same dynamics are happening, and that's part of what we should pay attention to, because that's part of what's so scary. Bad things are not just happening here. And I'm going to argue that a power inequality is at the root of pretty much all of them. So if we're thinking about how to make things better, I'm less interested in analyzing what's wrong, because I think lots of people do that, and there's a lot of things wrong. I'm interested in talking about how do we fix them. That's sort of what my organizer brain does. So the first thing I think is we have to ask ourselves, do you have a theory of power? Like, do you even have one? Like, if you're going to endeavor in a campaign, either as a strategic lawyer in a fight, all of our jobs need to be asking people, what's your theory of power? Do you actually have a theory of power in a campaign? I say in the beginning of No Shortcuts that when I ask that question, if I get hired, or I go into a room with a bunch of people and I say, so they're working on a campaign, they want to talk about the campaign, and I say, so what's your theory of power? And I say in the beginning of the book, it's like it produces crazy deer in the headlights looks most of the time when I ask that question. And that's usually when a campaign is starting or midway through it, right? So I think you have to have a theory of power. My second question is, what strategies align with your theory of power? And then I would argue for people who are in an academic environment where you have some time to think about this stuff more, it's what examples, if any, in history can you point to that actually show some evidence that your theory of power is going to gain traction or has a possibility of succeeding. Those were certainly the questions that I attacked my dissertation with several years back, when I came out of being in the field for 25 plus years, running and mostly being involved in winning campaigns. And not always easy ones, in fact, usually hard ones. So I'll come back to this later, but the harder the campaign, the more clear you have to be about the power analysis and the fight. The easier the campaign, you know, we can win easier campaigns without as much thought and attention to the question of the power structure analysis of the fight. So, on the question of the theory of power, again, this is just sort of a tease for a discussion today. I want to say a couple of things about it. In my view, there have been two substantial competing theories of power in the United States and certainly in the labor movement. And I would argue, in some ways in my dissertation or in my second book, I basically argued that the rise of what I call the mobilizing model in place of what I call deep organizing, I pinned it to really beginning in the early 1960s in the US, that there was a shift in our understanding of power and our thinking about power. But for today, I want to sharpen it a little bit and say that I'm talking about the last 20 years or so inside the trade union movement. In the labor movement, there's been a specific debate taking place. I'm a big advocate for one version of the theory of power, and I want to explain why today and use West Virginia to talk a little bit about why. But here's what I would sum them up to be. The two competing theories are basically mobilizing versus organizing. Under the mobilizing approach, I don't really call things models, but under what I call a mobilizing approach, the sort of mechanism that people talk about is sort of narrative change, and the solutions rely mostly on politics, elections, voting, sort of voting in what I call lesser offensive people compared to really offensive people. And then the result is that you get a sort of more liberal solution to what's actually a very deep problem that doesn't have simple liberal solutions, which again goes back to working class power. So the characterization of that for the certainly last decade, but even more, but more recently has been sort of the attention to low-wage worker crises, things like the fast food workers campaigns, Fight for 15, but an emphasis on very low-wage workers, on immigrant workers, on narrative change, a lot of public relations, like huge public relations budgets behind the campaigns. The goals are to sort of raise the floor from what I call abject poverty to something less than that, but not enough, I'm arguing, to actually get enough people out to really fight for it in substantial ways, because I don't want to fight to go from bad poverty to just a little bit less than bad poverty. Like, if I'm going to go all out personally in my life, I'm hoping for something better at the end of a big fight, and I think most workers are too. And the characterization of them is sort of mass protests. In fact, I'm writing a paper now that's comparing two big mass protests recently, Madison and Occupy, with two big strikes, the Chicago Teachers Union in West Virginia. And I'm going to dig into these questions again by comparing sort of hot, interesting looking, very tweetable protests versus actual withdrawals of labor. So the mobilizing approach tends to be winning in blue states only, or in blue regions of red states, meaning places where we already have sort of structural or social conditions that lean democratic, so to speak. And they haven't panned out in any place where the conditions aren't already sort of blue and sort of democratic. And that, I think, is the first indication that there's going to be a limitation to that strategy. And of course, we're seeing that since Trump just upended his labor board, the Department of Labor. Everything that they're doing right now is upending the theory on which, if there was a theory, that much of the low-wage worker campaigns were resting on, which was the idea that Hillary Clinton would win. We'd have another 4 years within the Department of Labor and the NLRB, and we'd force McDonald's into some concessionary strategy, and that was all contingent on a very narrow concept of the law, which has now been decimated. So, what can we do now? I'm arguing Back to the Future is essentially a strategy that we've always known about. It looks more like the 1930s, the 1920s, and the 1940s in this country, and it's called serious and real deep organizing. And even more than that, I mean, I'm putting the word class struggle up there because I think we avoid the terms power and class struggle. I just want to put it out. And interestingly, you know, it's like this is the United States, so I feel like this is why I'm compelled to say it. Like, I feel like I'm getting, I don't know if it's more radical, but more clear about some of these topics the older I get, and that's probably just because when you're running campaigns, honestly, I don't think I read nearly a whole book in 25 years. You know what I mean? I'd skim them. But I was mostly exhausted because I was working 19-hour days running huge campaigns. And the PhD program gave me time to, I say, take a nap and read. It was like my best sleep strategy was the PhD program. So I actually did make up for like 2.5 decades of not sleeping. And I actually got some more history under my belt. Maybe not as much as I want, but enough to make me feel even more grounded in the life arguments I've been arguing through experience, which is that class struggle is the theory of power that I adhere to, that I believe the withdrawal of labor in what I call strategic sectors can lead to creating a crisis, I think, to win against tough corporations, hello Harvard, and powerful and rich and wealthy powerful entities like the Koch brothers, the Mercers, and the many powerful entities that are funding and behind most of the takedown of what were the laws and regulations that movements that were much stronger, many decades past in this country, actually won, that you have to be able to create a crisis. The lesson of history and the lesson of the present is that when you are capable of creating an actual crisis for the targets of your campaign, you can win. So the question is, how do we best do that? I'm certainly arguing in the case of Occupy Wall Street or Madison that though, again, they were great, fun, I always said I love protests, I'm the first one to be there, and I like to make my homemade placard, and I like to climb up buildings, and you know, I'm going to yell and chant and scream. But a mass protest is not a strike, and they have very different outcomes if the strike is run well. So I argue that there are strategic sectors, and I'll come back to them in a minute, but certainly West Virginia is reflective of one of the ones that I wrote about in my dissertation. The theory of labor market power, as opposed to a sort of mobilizing top-down approach of raising the floor, is what we did in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and even beyond that to some degree in this country, which is we had strategic sectors. The CIO, the more radical of the labor federations in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, absolutely had strategic sectors. I always say you did not see big campaigns where they were running a campaign to organize the buggy whip factory, right? Buggy whips were kind of on the way out. And they were not equally focused on all sectors of workers. They had steel, they had coal, they had auto. They had a sense of what I call strategic sectors. And I think that we have strategic sectors today too, and I think we have to prioritize them as a movement. And by the way, I should say right at the outset, because it can sound a bit stark, I'm a strategist. So it's not that all workers don't matter. It's not that all humans don't matter. Everybody matters. Every worker matters. The question is, what's your theory of power to actually lead to long-term change for people? And I'm arguing that I still believe in strategic sectors, class struggle, and a labor market theory of power by which key workers within a labor market can struggle, create crisis, have the ability to struggle and create crisis and win. And from that, they then lift the floor because they're raising all standards. That's the history in this country that's actually worked, and I'm sticking to it. So the big difference is this is happening in red states and blue states. It's happening in red regions and blue regions. The withdrawal of labor, when we can do it, isn't reliant on pro-austerity, neoliberal, wimpy Democrats to get a bad race. It's actually relying on the workers' organization to demand something much stronger and result in much more significant victories. So I say high participation is a prerequisite to power. Just want to run through a few sort of pictures and slides to back up, but that was basically the heart of what I want to say today, is that there are two competing theories, and we need to be clear on which of them has more capacity to result in serious gains, meaning serious power for the working class. So definitely high participation, like what's your theory of participation, how do you get it, I think is a prerequisite to power, but it's not enough. As an organizer in any strike I've been involved in, which is many, in fact frighteningly probably more than most people alive right now, which is a problem, except for serious elders who are like retired. There's two other things that we need besides high participation. We need really good unity, and we need a serious, effective, tight structure in the workplace and across the workplaces in order to actually do what they did in West Virginia. So when I'm working with workers, and in 2016, I was involved in the largest organizing campaign in the United States, which I'm writing about now. So there's not as much out there because it was overshadowed by the Trump drama and the 2016 election. But every time I got in front of huge rooms of workers in 2016, I would say the same thing I've always said, which is you need high participation, you need unity, and you need structure. Those are the three things you need to win. And they're still the three things that you need to win. It's always been the three things that we need to win. So, before I go a lot further, I feel like nowadays, because the word strike is getting, I think, kind of, not sure what the word is, abused in its use, I want to go back to being clear about what I mean by a strike. And I'm quoting someone named John Steuben, who wrote a book called Strike Strategy. The first version of it was 1923, and it's as relevant today as it was nearly 100 years ago. And he said a strike is an organized cessation from work. It's the collective halting of production or services in a plant, industry, or area for the purpose of obtaining concessions from employers. A strike is labor's weapon to enforce labor's demands. So a strike is not a protest with a few workers out front and signs that you tweet. That's actually a protest. A strike is actually creating a crisis, and it's a mass withdrawal of labor. So that's the definition I'm using of what a strike is. And these women wearing bunny ears took down the power structure of a conservative state. That's teachers in West Virginia. If you don't know a lot about it, they actually forgot my bunny ears today. I'm usually presenting in bunny ears for the last 2 weeks. They were wearing bunny ears most of the time because the governor had unfortunately made the mistake of insulting all of them on February 6th in Logan County, West Virginia, at a hearing where they went to protest, saying that they needed more money for education, and the governor of the state, the guy who was a wimpy Democrat who became a wimpy Republican, I guess, made the mistake of calling them all dumb bunnies. And from his dumb bunnies insult came thousands and thousands and thousands of bunny ears that lasted throughout the strike. So I love the image of women wearing bunny ears decimating a trifecta Republican power structure in West Virginia, meaning a Republican governor, a Republican Senate, and a Republican Assembly. Why they won in West Virginia is very important. One, they had an industrial approach, which is all workers together. In fact, I argued in a couple of articles I've written so far about their strike that in some ways I kept wondering, this is a law school, I kept wondering, I was sitting in California during the strike, but interviewing people all throughout the strike, I kept wondering, when is the injunction coming? Like, why isn't there an injunction? This is all illegal. Why isn't there an injunction? And what I was told in interviews I did with a bunch of school superintendents, many of which were off the record, was that one, the Attorney General of the state had to have a sort of co-sponsor to do the injunction. So this is really important, like understanding the power structure of the fight. And that he couldn't actually get the people he needed to sign off on the injunction, which was the school superintendents. And the school superintendents, I'm going to argue certainly, and I have said in public, I think many were deeply sympathetic with the 34,000 workers who walked off the job, but they still had a lot of pressure on them at some point in a highly Republican state to sort of like stop being so embarrassed by, chicks and bunny ears, right? So, and the injunction didn't come. And what I understand from the school superintendents is the injunction didn't come because it was an all-out industrial workers approach, and because what the school superintendents kept saying to the Attorney General was, we have the right to enforce, we're responsible as superintendents of schools for basic safety. And if there are no bus drivers picking up the children in a rural state on deserted roads and one kid gets run over, it's all over for us. And so they actually could say every day the question was before them, and every day they said, we called up the bus drivers, which is the school service personnel, and asked, are the bus drivers driving buses today? And the bus drivers held in lockdown solidarity with the teachers and said, no bus drivers coming to work today. And the school superintendents every day basically just canceled school. So that's fascinating. So that's what you get in an industrial approach to the work. If there were simply no teachers, yes, there would have been a crisis, but it would have been a far different situation, is my argument. So it took all workers fighting together, also characterization of the 1930s and 40s in our country, and 50s. Because of that, they could create a crisis. It was a rank and file, bottom-up movement. There was very important actors who made up a sort of populist movement from below inside the teachers' union and began to demand more radical solutions, i.e., why don't we think about going on strike? The position holders, as I call them, in the unions, which were the elected leaders of the teachers' unions and the school student service personnel union, It did something very important, which was they decided not to fight the rank and file upsurge that was happening. They actually supported them. They actually understood that this was going to be good. And that is not always the case in our trade union movement, right? Sometimes when we have an upsurge from below, we have a union leadership, the position holders, that will fight very hard. That wasn't the case here. The position holders were, in fact, good and responsive to the demands and needs of the rank and file. And in the end, that was amazing. So they didn't fight. And I argue that the relationship between the position holders in the union, the official sort of state leadership bodies, which I contrast with the organic leaders, the rank and file folks on the ground, the position holders in the union leadership, they didn't just listen, they also gave some really good advice at key points in the strike. And there was a dynamic between the two of them that mattered a lot. And I think this sometimes goes unnoticed by sort of more radical elements in our progressive movement, which is that someone actually has to know how to settle. Like the word settle, settling a strike, settling a contract, actually negotiating a solution. We have a challenge in our country, which is that most people who consider themselves very radical have not had the experience of contending with a governor, a state senate, a state assembly, and serious power structures. And the problem is you only get to know how to do that by doing it. So we have this mismatch between a lot of progressive radicals who I consider near and dear to my heart, but who actually often can give rise to a big moment, but actually don't have a clear solution for how to get to settlement. And getting to settlement took the position holders in those unions. So in something I'm writing now that I haven't published yet, I say it took a more left, wonderful, beautiful bottom-up movement to start the strike, and it took a relationship between decent leadership, official leadership in the union, and their rank and file members to actually win the strike. And I think that's a super important point going forward. So that's me saying the key interaction to victory was between the left and the rank and file workers and the more experienced sort of negotiators. And that's a super important lesson, I think, for any future struggle. And then lastly, of course, they had massive community support. And community support is something I talk a lot about in both my books. But I don't believe, given the forces against us, like what's the endowment in this institution?
37 billion.
Oh, 37 billion. Like when you're going up against that kind of power, you've got to have the community with you, right? If you're heading into something like a strike, it's frankly essential. And they will go on a full-time crusade to try and make it so that you don't have that kind of support, right? That's what the movie Waiting for Superman was. I mean, what's interesting to me is that teachers in particular have been under attack, a sustained attack by hedge fund funded operations all over the country for going on a good 20 years now. When I did some research on it, I pinpointed it to an article in the Journal of Private Equity in 1995 that I read, that back in 1995, so try to update those numbers for today. I can't do math, I never could. But in this article in 1995, for private equity investors, it said the value of a K through 12 education, if you're an investor, is $500 billion if they could just get the teachers out of the way. So all they're doing is monetizing. They just want to get into public education because they just see dollar signs. So the beginning of the campaign begins in earnest, right? Probably in the turn of into the new millennium against teachers specifically. We know there's a broader anti-union, anti-working class crusade, but the fight against the teachers began in earnest probably 15 years ago. It began to uptick, and what I find fascinating, and probably you've heard this, I know that it's a source of frustration for me when I talk to like liberal friends of mine or just casual friends of mine, and you'll hear them repeat, you know, teachers unions kind of went too far, rubber room, all the stuff that people say, which are just memes from right-wing messaging. And then I'll say, well, so tell me about your kid's education. I'm like, oh man, my kid had a great education, love my teachers. It's like, well, that's a profound disconnect. And that disconnect is working in favor of teachers, because as long as teachers themselves explain their strike and struggle, actually to the parents, they can bust through a multi-million-dollar campaign against them. And that's what we're seeing in West Virginia, and we saw it in Chicago. So the key is the workers as agents themselves connecting with their own communities. And that actually defeats a serious and well-funded right-wing attack. That's part of why I think educators are in strategic sectors. So I'm going to skip over this for time because I already sort of talked about it. But this was the reference to the bunny. That was an article from just before the strike. where a lot of local press was talking about the nature of all the bunny costumes and bunny uniforms and dogs and bunnies and people and bunnies everywhere. And I think I want to say a few words about this. There are 5 core concepts that I think matter a lot to whether or not we're going to win and rebuild the kind of power that we need to challenge, not Trump. I find Trump to be so evilly distracting, but it's the forces behind Trump that I think we have to train our eyes to. Like, Trump is just a PR buffoon to distract everyone from the incredibly bad work that the forces that put him in power are actually up to. And they're serious. They're the serious forces, not him. And like, even in the last few days, when people show pictures of Scott Pruitt and liberals act so shocked, like, Scott Pruitt, how could he be head of the agency? He's totally against the environment. I'm like, well, that's the whole point of why Scott Pruitt is at that agency. You know what I mean? Like, they're not there to do anything but destroy the administrative state, as Steve Bannon came out and just said, which was so helpful a year and a half ago. So the 5 core concepts about building power that I think matter. 1, what I call structure versus self-selecting. That's how we endeavor to get into fights, and I'll come back to that in a second. But workplaces are structured environments. That's a hint to the next slide. The second is that we have to build movements that are what I call organic leader focused versus activist focused. And I'll talk about each of these briefly before I stop. The third is that we need to, the reason I like to work in what I call a structure-based environment is because you will know as an organizer inside of any structure-based environment whether or not you're building to majorities or you're not. Like, you can actually test all of your actual activism and organizing because you can actually measure whether or not you're building to majorities if you're in what I call a structured environment. The 4th point is what I was just making about the educators' relationship to them themselves going to reach out to their communities, because when the educators do that, they can puncture through a multi-million-dollar assault, public relations assault on them by the organized right. That's a whole worker organizing approach versus a more top-down community labor approach. And all of that adds up to what I call an organizing approach to the work versus a mobilizing approach. And I think it's sort of back to the future. It's like we have to go back to good old-fashioned organizing to get out of the kind of mess that we're in right now. And we have to spend most of our time talking with, not at, but engaging with the huge masses of people who are actually not showing up at any of our meetings, are not in our social media feeds, and are not actually engaged by us. And organizing, to me, is about understanding how to make a credible plan to do that. That's actually what organizing is. Effective organizing is waking up every morning with a credible plan for how to reach out to people who are not actually engaging with us. That's base building, that's expansion of the universe of people we can then mobilize from for things like elections and marches. So quickly, structure versus self-selecting, just to cut it clear, because I think it matters very, very much in a theory of power. Structures are workplaces, churches, mosques, temples, etc., sort of the universe of faith-based organizing, housing complexes, neighborhood schools. Self-selecting organizations are most single-issue environmental groups, women's groups, the Women's March, Occupy Wall Street, essentially single-issue fights, where you call a rally, you call a protest, and the universe is anyone. And anyone can show up. And so you might have a good protest, you might have a lot of people, but you actually have no idea, like, is what you're doing working, or you're just gathering up all of the already committed to our cause people. Because there aren't enough people who are already committed to sort of radical change, right? So that's, to me, what activism produces. Activism is both productive of and results from what I call self-selecting approaches to the work. And organizing and critical base expansion and power building comes from structure-based organizing. And again, it's not so either or in the sense that we don't need, an Occupy and a climate change campaign, whatever we do. That's fine, and I'm down with that. But our movement's priorities need to be around structure-based organizing. That's my argument. And if you look at the 2 most powerful movements in this country, the civil rights movement and the trade union movement of yesterday, they were both structure-based movements, and they won by far the most structural change in our society, and it held tight until, recently. And now the Voting Rights Act is going, and they're coming for Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security now, and things that have withstood the test of time for decades are under attack right now. But it took decades for them to build the power to come after what I call structural changes that resulted from structurally based movements. And again, my argument as an organizer and a strategist is that if I'm in a structure-based environment, I know if what I'm doing every day as an organizer is working or not working, because we're actually getting to majorities or we're not. So when you just call a rally, I was working with a different teachers union yesterday, and they said, well, when we call rallies, we get a pretty good turnout. And I said, and they said, the problem for us is the number is stagnant. I'm gonna leave the state out. And I said, but are you assessing how many came from each school each time you do that rally? Because the only way you know if you're growing is if you're doing a school-by-school assessment, right? Mass marches don't give you, right? You might just be turning out the same activist every time. That's not winning. We can't turn the same people out every time. We have to be growing our mass movement, and that's what organizing is. There's something I call structure tests. Now you're gonna watch me go into like warp speed for a few minutes, because I do want to be able to stop and make sure that people can have some time for questions and discussion. But they're mostly pictures from here on out, and then I'm just gonna close. So I'm obsessed as an organizer with something called structure test. That's why today's talk is called the Strike as Structure Test. And that's why I'm into structure-based organizing, so all these words begin to link up. The structure test, I say, is a mechanism to understand actually how much unity and solidarity is being built to challenge the power structure. That's why I obsess about them. It's one of the hardest fights, not the easy ones. I said that. We actually have to know how much power is required and how much power is available. So the heart of my dissertation, the heart of No Shortcuts, was me beginning to really analyze, is power measurable? To me, the answer is yes. I actually think power is measurable. That'll be my next, not the next one, but the next book I'm working on, because I need like 2 years to do nothing but it. So I actually think power is measurable. And I think there's 2 factors I look at as a strategist in every campaign. How much power does the people that we're going up against, how much power they possess, which therefore helps me calibrate how much power do we need. And then looking at our troops on our side, it's how much power is actually available to us, and do we have ways to measure it? And my argument is we can measure all of it. And I think that's why I've had the pleasure of being involved in a lot of winning campaigns, is because I've been thinking a lot about how to measure power, theirs and ours, and then how to actually grow ours as against theirs. And by the way, run a lot of divide and conquer strategies against them, which is what they otherwise do to us. So don't forget to run divide and conquer among and between them, because we're not good enough at that. So, and here's a quick summary of what a structure-based environment is and a structure test, and then I'll stop. Because if there's nothing else that you leave here with except realizing there's a few concepts: power, power available, power required, structure-based organizing as a faster route to building power because it's more measurable, I'll be very happy, and I hope you will be too. But these are the core concepts. So this is called big wall charting for union organizers that are generally still winning very tough campaigns. We tend to have what we call big wall charts, which are public, not public to the bosses, by the way, but public to each of our colleagues and our coworkers. I wonder if you can kill is there a way to kill the light that's like right there? That'd be helpful. Thank you. I should have said that earlier, actually. If you can kill the front row. But what this shows is from a campaign in Philadelphia. Yeah, that's kind of better. Thank you. Excellent. So what you see in that chart is one unit in a big hospital in Philadelphia, one unit only, and in a good organizing campaign, you actually have every single unit, every single workplace publicly charted like this, because they're a structure. A unit is a structure inside a larger structure called a hospital. And this is what I was doing during my Harvard postdoc, by the way, Jack. Anyway, so this campaign, I disappeared from Harvard for a little while to work on. So this is one unit, and basically you take all the workers who work in that unit and you put their names on a big public, I believe in them being big sort of wall chart. You put everyone's names on it, and then you start to launch what I call structure tests. And structure tests are mass petitions, they're photo things, they're sticker-ups, they're button-ups, they're things that you can actually measure. So for example, the dots next to their names, the blue one means they signed a union authorization card saying they wanted to vote for the union. The green one said, the green dot means they signed our vote yes to a public petition that we marched on the CEO that said I'm going to vote yes for the union. The red one shows us that that worker signed the negotiations petition, demanding that the boss get to the table because they had filed legal charges against us in this particular hospital. The yellow one tells us that they signed the contract action survey. So, and then the yellow over their names, at this point we were further along in the campaign, we had won. They don't re-election, though we had not won a legal challenge yet, but we had people signing up to act like a union even though we didn't have one yet. So the yellow meant that they were signing union authorization cards. So basically each item on here is a structure test. And this is a way that you teach the workers themselves to learn what unity and structure looks like. So as an organizer, there's never going to be enough people with experience. My job is to teach people how to do this work. I see my job as teaching and enabling workers to do this kind of work. So that's why I'm in favor of big wall charts. So that's day shift, night shift, the whole thing. And by the way, if you can't tell, if it's not yet obvious from this approach, they're kicking ass in the surgical intensive care unit. Like, they're doing great. Almost every worker is participating in almost every structure test. That means that we found what I call the organic leader in that unit, and that worker, that organic leader among her peers, mostly her peers in a case of nurses, is actually effectively leading her entire unit, right? In the private sector, we can't even go into the facility. We can't get in to talk to those workers, which is why I think we've evolved a very intense approach of really knowing how to identify the most respected workers. And then if we're successful recruiting them, because sometimes they're anti-union, right? If we're successful at recruiting them, they can actually do the work that we otherwise think of as staff doing. So that unit's in amazing shape. This is labor and delivery, a different department. You can see the difference. It's a little bit uneven. There's a little less participation in each of the structure tests, but by the way, we'd still be winning if every department looked like labor and delivery at that point in the campaign. Now, what's happening in Tower 5? That's a question.
Not good.
Not good, exactly, right? So Tower 5, we had a giant mess, because in that case, the organic leader was, at that point in the campaign, loyal to the opposition, meaning to the boss, and was running an anti-union campaign inside the hospital. So the key is, when I say there's a leader approach versus an activist approach, the one person that we had in that unit, you can see her name up there, Liz Miller, classic, great activist, came to every meeting, loved everything, down with the program, but was not able to actually move the majority of her coworkers to take action in the campaign. And part of why I love public wall charting in a structure-based environment, not just because it teaches people how to do this work themselves, but also because it's super clear where you have to prioritize your work and where you don't. And prioritization is very important to win big campaigns. So that's the workers themselves working on their wall charts in Philadelphia. These are examples of what structure tests look like. I'm just going to put up a couple. They're super simple. They require nothing. As you can see, you can make a wall chart with just Sharpie markers and anything available at your local grocery store. Like, that's my goal as an organizer, is not to have sophisticated databases and printout sheets that make it so that only people who have access to databases with printouts control the information. This is about enabling people in large numbers to take control of their campaigns and their lives. So structure tests are, forget social media, just forget it. Nothing online. Like, there's no campaign I've run, even today, that involves anything online. You're not testing your structure if you're relying on social media. This is about hand-to-hand combat, because that's what's required to actually win against tough employers and tough bosses in general, and the political elite who are destroying our country. So they're hand-signed petitions. Other than that, small comment. Yeah, but they are. So this is another example of a structure test, just to show you a very beautiful one that was actually just a serious structure test. This is the Chicago Teachers Union strike vote. They had to fill that room more than once to know that they had the 75% threshold to strike. They had taken multiple structure tests before they even thought they had the power to actually fill the room, right? Because they didn't need a 75% out threshold. So that's actually a form of a structure test. Particularly beautiful one. And I'm going to close on this slide, which is what we suffer from, again, is a power inequality. And the reason we have austerity, which is sort of a fake concept that we're broke, we are not broke in this country. We are not broke. There is gobs of billions and billions of dollars sitting around and grotesque wealth. So going back to sort of income inequality, that I want to rename a power inequality, we need more power to address income inequality. And frankly, that means challenging austerity. And I am putting my money on the mostly women in what I call mission-driven strategic sectors going forward right now. That's education and healthcare, but it's not only education and healthcare, but I'm particularly putting my money on women-led organization in things like hospitals, nursing homes, healthcare, schools, universities, fill in the blank, K through 12, all of it. They tend to be, first of all, they're growing sectors of our economy. So these are not going away. They're growing sectors of the economy. They're large sectors of the economy. I think women-led gives a different character to the strikes that we're seeing. Besides bunny ears, I also mean like cooperation at a different level. The mission-driven nature means that they have the ability to bring their whole community with them, despite right-wing assault. We saw that from Chicago to West Virginia. Chicago to West Virginia couldn't be more different, right? Multicolor, 94% black city, urban, up north, white, rural, scattered, down south. I mean, the differences are huge. If you start isolating variables, it's pretty exciting. And of course, an industrial approach, meaning all out, all united, all out together. Because the solution to the education and the healthcare crisis, by the way, there is no way out of it but to get to the revenue question. Because the Democratic Party and the Clinton faction of the Democratic Party, we've been avoiding the revenue question for several decades. In the early 1990s, when the Democratic leadership, the DLC, came into the Democrats and Tony Blair came into the Labour Party in England, same time, they ushered in an era where corporations became more important than the working class of the party. And for that, we have austerity. And to that of austerity means you've got to retax the rich and corporations. In West Virginia, it was the Democratic governor, Manchin, who cut the corporate tax rate of West Virginia in the 1990s from 9% to 6.75%. And that gap is why the working class in the public sector have been paying for massive increases in their healthcare costs and getting no raises. So while it happened on a trifecta red state watch, really the cause of the blame there initially was a Democratic Party that became more loyal to corporations than to workers. And the people who I think have the ability to really question the moralness of our economy or the lack of moralness in our economy are women in healthcare and education primarily, for whom the solution is going to be retaxing the rich and corporations. In West Virginia, the solution to the long-term healthcare crisis that they're looking at, the progressives, certainly the unions, is about reinstituting the taxes that Manchin, the Democrats, undid 20 years ago. And that's got to play out state after state after state. If we don't get to the revenue question, which is a question of power, we're not going to be able to pull the country out of the doldrums that we're in right now. So, thank you. Doesn't leave us a lot of time, but I'm told we have the room for probably another 10 minutes or so. So if anyone has a question or a comment besides mine, which is make sure the grad students win, grad student workers win, yes. Besides that comment, yes. Did I see a hand there?
I guess, like, how do people become okay with doing things that are not legal?
That are not legal.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a great question. First of all, safety in numbers helps. Like, that's part of what enabled it's part of what stopped the injunction from happening. But I think that everything is about safety in numbers, which goes back to structure-based organizing. So there's a much longer discussion about, like in the telemetry unit on the slide where there was sort of not much happening, almost nothing happening in that unit. It helped us do nothing but focus on that unit for a while in the campaign, because the truth is, no one could win in that particular contract fight. No workers were going to win if we couldn't flip the anti-union leaders in the telemetry unit. That's how big the unit was as a percentage of the workers in the hospital. Roughly, I love to teach on that campaign because I really can't do math, and there were 1,000 nurses in the unit, and telemetry had a percentage big enough that we couldn't have gotten to what I call a credible strike threat or a credible strike. So it helps us prioritize. And when workers come to understand from our approach, or anyone, worker, neighbor in a fight about sustainable communities, whatever the battle is that you're engaged in, when people who are not already hardcore committed activists, but you've got to persuade lots of other people along into our movements, there's an art to having a successful one-on-one conversation. And a lot of it is about, first of all, putting the agency on the person that you're engaging and the people that you're engaging, right? Helping people understand that nothing's going to change unless they actually take action, because there is no other way to change, and that involves risk. And the more people understand that the fight is going to be up to them to win, and that there isn't any other way to win except to start to escalate their actions, that's the main way that I've been able to get people to do things that are very, very scary. And then when I showed you the structure tests, part of what's so important about them, and I usually have tons of pictures, this is just a short time period, so I didn't want to do tons of pictures, but what really matters in the theory of structure tests and campaigns is that you start with the one I showed you, like a majority hand-signed petition, which in and of itself is scary. Because actually, almost every campaign I've ever been involved in, people from the outside think, oh, well, signing a petition, that couldn't have been scary. No, it's really scary if you have a union buster in your workplace, because every worker's like, I'm not signing that, because they're gonna take a magnifying glass and like actually do handwriting analysis and see my name, right? Which is actually, by the way, true. So workers aren't stupid. So they're scared to death to sign those petitions, because they're what we call public petitions. So stage one, it is something like signing a petition. We're using it as a structure test in a bunch of ways, and it's going to get to risk and fear. First, it's letting me as an organizer understand, I handed that petition to Bobby, and I'm trying to see, can Bobby get all the signatures done in 3 days? If Bobby can get most of her coworkers to sign that petition in her unit in 3 days, that means Bobby is an organic leader, that she actually has the trust and respect of her coworkers. If I hand that to Sue, and Sue comes back 3 weeks later with a minority of the signatures in her unit, that tells me that I'm gonna rely more on Bobby than Sue, right? One has more respect to their coworkers and one has less. And Bobby and Sue are super important, that's what I mean. They're equally important in theory, they're just differently important and they need different roles in your campaign. So then you start to increase the fear factor in what the structure tests are. So you start with a lot of hand-signed petitions. Let me just say there's another reason you start with hand-signed petitions. And the reason is because no one knows if you fail. And in the beginning, you might fail, right? So if you call a rally and people don't show up, like in West Virginia, the wonderful, beautiful rank and file from below leaders called a big rally for Martin Luther King Day and announced that it was going to be massive with thousands of people, and they kept telling everyone it was going to be thousands of people, and a few hundred showed up. Don't do that. You know what I mean? The reason you do structure tests like petitions to gauge your readiness is because you can actually gauge your readiness without the boss seeing you fail. And that's an important lesson too if you're running a big campaign. So then you start to increase the risk factor, which moves people from socialized to be fearful to re-socializing themselves to be fearless. So if the first one's a petition, the second one's a petition, third one's a petition, and each time you ask them to march together to deliver it to the CEO, your marches of who's coming to those march on the bosses, we call them, need to get bigger and bigger. So now you're actually re-socializing. Like our culture, our mass media, our entire society is a culture about individual success and about fear, right? Trump is all about fear. So organizing is partly about sort of reconditioning people to understand risk-taking and that you're safe in large numbers. So don't set them up to fail, set them up to win. So we'll start with a lot of petitions until we know we've got the right organic leaders, the most respected workers, and people who will, I always say, it's someone who you trust who's going to pull you through a fearful moment. It's not me. If I'm an agent in a big campaign, I have no ability to walk up to thousands of workers and say, trust me, man, I've done this before, like, trust me, walk out, done, over. You know what I mean? They're not going to trust me. People trust who they know and who they respect. So that person has to be the person to say, if we all do this together, you're going to be safe, right? That's the idea behind on the front end of campaigns, figuring out who the organic leader is. And then, so you begin to re-socialize people to act collectively, not individually, and socialize them towards being fearless, not fearful. And that takes place over a series of, depends how long your campaign is, but months, usually months. And it happens fast, actually, because as they begin to see, oh, look, a majority signed that petition. Wow, 85% of us signed that petition. Then we'll eventually go to photo posters. And you put your photo on a poster, that's a new level of risk of challenging your CEO. So by the time you get to something like calling for a strike or an election, you actually already know what the numbers are going to be. Like, you actually know what's going to happen. And people are reconditioning their brains to challenge authority and not to be fearful of authority. So I hope that helps, but there really is a lot behind it. It's not rocket science, but there's actually a fair amount behind how do we help enable tens of thousands and millions of people to do what has to be done in this country, which is a lot more strikes in an era where our political system is flat broken.
One clarification on structure outside of labor organizing. You cited the civil rights movement. What made the civil rights movement a structure? So is it the fact that it was connected to real world institutions like churches as opposed to Occupy Wall Street? What is structure as
great.
structure?
Mainly the black church. right? That the black church was the organizing arm of the civil rights movement. That's the main part of why, when I did the analysis for No Shortcuts, that's what I'm looking at. Even though there were key activists beyond it, there were many other players involved in it, but the initial and I think the measurable parts of the power that was built in the civil rights movement. I mean, there was a lot of radical labor organizers who went down there, right, who understood structure-based organizing and could you count, but the structure was the black church. That was the foundation of it.
So what about in places where there's not an institution already? So let's say undocumented workers, the environment,
Yeah.
winning a primary election.
Yeah, great question. So two things. One is, I'm going to argue our priority has to be on the structured ones. So that's a movement decision. And part of what we're missing today that we had in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s were sophisticated political parties that actually helped guide people to focus on the areas that we had to focus on. We're sort of missing that today. We're like missing a brain, which is why we seem rather like we're flailing as a movement right now against Trump. So protests alone won't work. So one is get our priorities straight. Right, that's what I'm trying to help people understand, is that we need to prioritize the structure-based environments because they help us measure our power and grow our base. But I've definitely run campaigns that were not reliant, right? I worked in the environmental movement for a long time before I became a trade union organizer. So I, as an organizer, I create structure anywhere I go. Like I basically don't start the campaign until I figure out how to make structure. So that might be I decide it's going to be a block-by-block structure. That might be I use political precinct at the smallest level as a structure. I've got to be able to test a universe of turnout, and are we getting new people all the time or not? So I will create a structure somehow as an organizer, because I think what we don't do well is understand how to measure if we're growing our power. So that's the main thing. Like I've had low-wage worker campaigns and lots of different people ask me, and in a much longer, like when I do multi-day trainings on it, like I'll work with people on how to create a structure where there seems to be no structure, because that's the first step. And once you create a sort of virtual structure, but not virtual, something that's real that you can measure against, then you can begin to figure out who's the organic leader, because you've got to figure out where you've got them, let them do the work, and then you've got to move on to where the weak spots are, right? That's the nature of the work. So I think we can create structure. It's harder, but that's my big message, is that if I was running an environmental campaign, which I used to, or a climate campaign, I would break whole neighborhoods, cities, or regions into something bite-sizable by which you can begin to measure, have we got someone from the 4 blocks covering this area around the plant? Let's make 5 other blocks around the plant in this direction, or the political precincts, or something. And then if you're running a low-wage campaign, by the way, you don't just have to figure out often how to build a structure. It could be the churches again, right? Because a lot of low-wage workers in this country are, in fact, in houses of faith, whether it's a mosque, a synagogue, or whatever, it's usually a mosque or a church of some kind, just given the demographics. But they can become the unit to assess turnout again, right? So I always say get creative about how to figure out a structure by which you can measure, is anything you're doing actually working? Which is a question we just don't ask often enough. We see a protest, people come up, we're like, woo, we feel psyched, but we have no idea what we're building just by looking at the size of a protest. Let's see, one over here, one up there, one down here, and one up there. And then we probably have to let the class in, right? So 2 more, and I'll try and do them quickly.
So you said unity is extremely important to win, but how have campaigns that you've worked on handled increasing levels of disunity between white people and people of color, for example, or people living in rural versus urban areas of the state?
Yeah, great question. It happens all the time, by the way. So, like all the time. Like, I've never been involved in a campaign where disunity wasn't a central issue. And particularly because I'm usually going up against some of the most sophisticated union busters in this country. So disunity, just like Steve Bannon and Donald Trump's entire campaign, disunity is the strategy for their side, right? So we have to take race on centrally in this country. We have to take gender on centrally in this country. We have to take on urban-rural differences. Again, that's why I love looking at the difference between Chicago and West Virginia. Like when people say, well, Chicago is so unique, and people who don't believe in this stuff, oh, West Virginia, okay, it's starting to get less unique, hello, anyway. So, but all those issues have to be addressed head-on.